Liberation of the Philippines from the Japanese. General MacArthur, who had promised to return, landed in Leyte in October 1944, thus commencing the military campaign to liberate the Philippines from the Japanese. In the ensuing struggle, Manila and most of the major Philippine cities suffered grievous damage. MacArthur declared the military campaign on Luzon closed on July 4, 1945, but the bulk of Japanese ground forces were still in Sac and the mountains. Fighting continued in Mindanao, and Japan has not yet surrendered. The Philippine Commonwealth government returned with General MacArthur. Quezon had died while in the United States, and Sergio Osmania, the vice president, automatically took over. Osmania landed with MacArthur on Leyte, and as the Battle of Manila neared its end, restored the government to the Malacanang Palace and the Manila. Uh, while in Washington, the Commonwealth government did all it could to hasten the return of American forces to the Philippines. It also sought to be ensure that war damage would be rehabilitated by the U.S. government. The Philippines actively participated in the early meetings that would result in the United Nations. Upon return to Manila, Tasmania pledged as a Philippine Army division to participate in the assault landing on Japan. Guerrillas, now part of the army, trained accordingly. The atomic bombs negated the need for such action, and Japan accepted the Allied terms on August 15, 1945.
As the war ended, the Philippines counted the cost. Over 1 million Filipinos had died or were killed, out of the population of 18 million. Should the original timetable for independence be kept, the tasks facing Osmania and the Commonwealth government were daunting. None of this had been foreseen when the Tidings and McDuffie Act had become law. Apart from the physical destruction and the loss of lives, the Philippines was divided. There had been those who had collaborated with the Japanese, while most had resisted either directly or indirectly. People had to be fed, clothed, and given shelter. All the basic necessities were initially provided by the U.S. Army: water, clothing, food, power, communications, and jobs. Other assistance came in from the United States and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration as the piers were restored and ships arrived. Peace and order. Problems were serious, some stemming from the pre-war social and agrarian issues. Others because of loose for arms. Guerrilla units were plenty, but not all were legitimate, and there was an upsurge of crimes. Morality was in tatters, as people had to survive in whatever ways they could. Inflation was rampant, even as the government strove to bring prices down with newly printed currency and price controls. Besides, after having been away for 3 years, it was a difficult task to win back the people's confidence in the government.
So, the Philippine Congress was convened in June 1945, the first time it since the election of November 1941. Some of its members had died during the war. Others were tainted by charges of collaboration. It began its work of legislating, but was hampered by the unstable post-war conditions. Osmeña traveled to the United States 3 times in 1945, a last meeting with FDR in April, and 2 meetings with President Harry Truman to negotiate aid and assistance for the Philippines, as well as assurances that independence would come as scheduled. For a while and earlier, independence date was approached, but this would have required legislation which was not a priority. There were muttering that Philippine independence be delayed owing to the unsettled conditions after the war, but this would mean political suicide to those seeking office. And so independence would take place as planned on July 4, 1946. The government was now more strongly reliant on the United States, more so than before the war. The Philippine Army was totally dependent on the US Army for equipment and weapons, and relief only coming from the United States. External defense would now be too costly for the cash-strapped government. Thus, the presence of US bases could be seen as mutually beneficial.
Paul B. McNutt, who held the position in the late 1930s, was the final American High Commissioner. On a number of issues, he gave Osmeña advice. The Philippines would find it challenging to deal harshly with alleged collaborators given the numerous challenges at hand. But Secretary of the State Harold insisted on it. If the government did not punish those who had broken their oaths of devotion to the United States, Ike threatened to withhold aid. Senator Millard Tydings, a co-author of the pre-war Philippine Independence Act, was a supporter of the Philippines in Washington. He supported a bill that he believed would provide adequate funding for rehabilitation. However, he discovered after a personal trip to the Philippines that the initial budget estimates had been too low and that additional funding was required. His measure did give the Philippines a generous $620 million, which was later increased to $800 million. However, Representative Jasper Bell's trade bill was linked to the rehabilitation legislation. The Bill Trade Bill attempted to extend the period of reciprocal tariff-free trade between the United States and the Philippines for an additional 8 years. Bell believed that Americans needed to be granted the same rights as Filipinos in order to persuade them to invest in the Philippines. This called for altering the 1935 Philippine Constitution, which restricted property ownership and natural resource access to Filipino citizens and corporations with a majority of Filipinos owners. Thus, in order to receive the majority of the Tydings Bill's rehabilitation help, the parity amendment would become necessary. The Philippine peso was similarly pegged to the US dollar via the Bill Trade Bill. There were other concerns that surfaced just before independence. President Truman signed the Rescission Law in 1946, nullifying the military service of the majority of the Filipino veterans and depriving them of benefits. Early in 1946, there was still a significant U.S. military presence, with the 86th Infantry Division fully operational and ready to defend American interests. After World War II ended, many of its participants argued that they had served their purpose and should be brought home. But with long-standing agrarian issues still unresolved, there was growing unrest in the provinces. There were still many military installations under U.S. control, and discussions about which would remain in place following Philippine independence started. The Tydings-McDuffie Act stipulated that the U.S. would keep bases there even after the Philippines gained independence in order to safeguard its interests